The courthouse records in Charleston, South Carolina, still bear the faded ink of what locals call the boot deception, a marriage certificate dated March 15, 1855. The document's one of the most disturbing family secrets in American history. The bride's signature appears twice on the same document, once as Eleanor Ravenel, adopted daughter, and again as Eleanor Beaufort, lawful wife to the same man who had raised her as his own child for 8 years. But what the official records don't reveal is far more sinister. A calculated pattern of murder, fraud, and manipulation that spanned decades across the Carolina Low Country, leaving entire bloodlines erased and fortune stolen. The Beaufort family didn't just break moral boundaries. They systematically eliminated anyone who stood between them and the vast rice plantations that made them one of the wealthiest families in the antebellum South. Before we continue with the story of Eleanor Ravenel and the twisted legacy of the Beaufort dynasty, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more dark historical mysteries, and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. These American secrets deserve to be heard. What happened in that grand Charleston mansion between 1847 and 1855 would challenge everything we think we know about family, loyalty, and the lengths to which people will go to protect their wealth and power. Charleston in 1847 stood as the crown jewel of Southern society, where Spanish moss-draped oak trees lined cobblestone streets and the scent of jasmine mixed uneasily with the harsh realities of a slave-based economy. The city's elite lived in magnificent mansions south of Broad Street, their wealth built on the backs of rice and cotton plantations that stretched across the Carolina Low Country like a patchwork quilt of human suffering and agricultural abundance. Among these powerful families, the Beauforts occupied a position of particular prominence, their name carved into the marble facades of banks, their influence reaching into every corner of Charleston's political and social machinery. Silas Beaufort, at 52, commanded respect through a combination of old money charm and ruthless business acumen. His thick silver hair and piercing blue eyes gave him the appearance of a distinguished patriarch, while his soft-spoken manner concealed the mind that calculated profit margins with the same precision other men used to count their prayers. He had inherited Magnolia Grove, a sprawling rice plantation that employed over 300 enslaved workers. But his true wealth came from something far more complex, a network of land acquisitions that had, over the decades, consolidated much of the prime agricultural territory between Charleston and Savannah under Beaufort control. The Beaufort mansion on East Bay Street rose 3 stories above the harbor, its piazzas catching the evening breeze while offering commanding views of the ships that carried Charleston's wealth to markets in New York, Boston, and beyond. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across mahogany floors, while portraits of Beaufort ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their eyes holding secrets that would die with their bloodline. Silas lived there with his wife Margaret, a delicate woman whose frequent illnesses kept her confined to the upper floors, and their 3 children, Charles, 25, and already managing plantation operations, Victoria, 22, and considered one of Charleston's most eligible young women, and William, 19, and studying law at the College of Charleston. The family maintained the outward appearance of Southern gentility, hosting elaborate dinner parties where political connections were cultivated over turtle soup and Madeira wine, while their private conversations revealed a different truth. Behind closed doors, the Beauforts discussed their business with the cold efficiency of military strategists, viewing the Low Country's geography not as ancestral homeland, but as territory to be conquered, one family at a time. This carefully constructed world of privilege and power began to show cracks in the autumn of 1847, when a series of unusual deaths among neighboring plantation families started drawing unwanted attention from Charleston's gossip networks. The Ravenel family tragedy would soon add another chapter to this growing list of suspicious circumstances, though at the time few suspected that these seemingly random misfortunes were connected by invisible threads of greed, manipulation, and carefully orchestrated violence. The fire that consumed the Ravenel plantation began just after midnight on November 3, 1847, during one of the driest autumns in Low Country memory. Neighbors reported seeing flames that seemed to dance against the sky like demons celebrating their own destructive power, while the acrid smell of burning timber mixed with something far more unsettling, a chemical odor that suggested the fire had been fed by more than just dried wood and cotton. The blaze consumed the main house with such intensity that by dawn nothing remained but blackened chimney stones and the twisted metal remains of what had once been furniture and family heirlooms. James Ravenel and his wife Sarah died in the flames along with their newborn son, leaving only 10-year-old Eleanor as the sole survivor. The child was found 3 days later by search parties wandering through the burned remains of the estate gardens, her clothes singed and her eyes holding a thousand-knee stare that spoke of horrors beyond her years. She clutched a small wooden doll, its painted face partially melted from the heat, and spoke only in whispers about the men with the masks who had come in the night. Dr. Sewell Hamilton Prescott, who examined Eleanor in the days following the tragedy, noted in his private medical journals that the child showed signs of severe shock, but no physical injuries consistent with fire exposure. More puzzling still, she possessed detailed knowledge of events that occurred in other parts of the house during the fire, knowledge that would have been impossible for her to acquire as she had truly been sleeping in her upstairs bedroom when the flames began. When pressed for details, Eleanor would only repeat that she had hidden where Papa told me to hide when the bad men came. Though no such hiding place was ever discovered in the ruins, the official investigation, led by Sheriff Thomas Ruplid, concluded that the fire had started from an overturned oil lamp in James Ravenel's study. This explanation satisfied most observers, particularly given the family's recent financial difficulties following several poor rice harvests. What the investigation didn't examine were the peculiar circumstances surrounding the fire's pattern of destruction, how it had consumed the main house while leaving the slave quarters and outbuildings largely untouched, or why the plantation's valuable livestock had been moved to distant pastures just days before the blaze. Most significantly, the investigation failed to account for several key documents that neighbors knew James Ravenel kept in his study safe: land deeds, inheritance papers, and survey maps that proved his family's ownership of territories stretching far beyond the boundaries of their immediate plantation. These papers, which would have made Eleanor one of the wealthiest AISCs in South Carolina, simply vanished in the flames, leaving no legal record of the vast holdings that should have been her birthright. Within hours of the fire's discovery, Silas Beaufort arrived at the scene with the efficiency that seemed almost preternatural. He claimed to have learned of the tragedy from a field and who had seen the flames from Magnolia Grove. The later testimony revealed inconsistencies in this timeline that were never properly investigated. Beaufort immediately took charge of the situation, arranging for proper burial of the victims and personally ensuring that young Eleanor received immediate medical attention and temporary shelter. His generosity seemed to emerge from genuine Christian charity, and the Charleston community praised his quick action during a family's darkest hour. What they didn't know was that Silas Beaufort had been the last person to visit James Ravenel alive, meeting with him privately, just 2 days before the fire, to discuss what Ravenel had described to his wife as urgent business matters that could change everything for our family. The years following Eleanor's adoption into the Beaufort household passed like chapters in a carefully edited book, each page revealing only what the family wanted Charleston society to see. Eleanor grew from a traumatized child into a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence, her golden hair and green eyes making her the subject of admiring comments at church gatherings and social functions. To outside observers, the Beauforts had performed an act of exceptional Christian charity, raising an orphan child as their own daughter and providing her with every advantage their wealth could offer. But within the walls of the East Bay Street mansion, a different story unfolded with each passing season. Eleanor received the finest education money could buy, tutored in literature, music, and languages by governesses imported from Charleston's most prestigious families. Yet her studies were always supervised, her correspondence monitored, and her movements carefully controlled under the guise of protecting her from the traumatic memories of her childhood. She was never allowed to visit the ruins of her family's plantation, told that such places would only disturb her delicate constitution and reopen wounds that had taken years to heal. Margaret Beaufort's health continued to decline throughout these years, her frequent confinements to bed becoming more prolonged and mysterious. Dr. Prescott made regular visits to the mansion, his black medical bag a familiar sight on the front steps, though his treatment seemed to provide little relief. Servants whispered among themselves about Margaret's strange symptoms, sudden episodes of confusion, violent stomach pains that came and went without warning, and periods of memory loss that left her unable to recognize her own children. As Eleanor approached her 18th birthday in the spring of 1855, subtle changes began to occur in the household's daily rhythm. Charles Beaufort, who had always treated her with brotherly affection, began avoiding her company, his face darkening whenever she entered a room. Victoria, once Eleanor's closest confidant, started making cryptic comments about family obligations and the sacrifices required to maintain their position in Charleston society. Even the servants who had watched Eleanor grow from child to woman began treating her with a strange mixture of pity and fear. The transformation became most apparent in Silas Beaufort himself. The man who had once told bedtime stories and wiped away tears from childhood nightmares now studied Eleanor with calculating eyes, his conversations taking on the tone of business negotiations rather than paternal guidance. He began discussing her future with increasing urgency, emphasizing the importance of keeping family assets consolidated and protected from outside interference. When Eleanor asked about marriage prospects among Charleston's eligible young men, Silas would change the subject with uncomfortable abruptness, suggesting that such decisions required careful consideration of factors she didn't yet understand. The first concrete indication of the family's true intentions came during a conversation Eleanor accidentally overheard between Silas and his son Charles in the plantation office. Through the slightly open door, she listened in growing horror as they discussed her as if she were a piece of property to be managed rather than a beloved daughter to be protected. Charles expressed concerns about the legal complications while his father spoke with cold pragmatism about necessary arrangements in eliminating potential problems before they could arise. That night, Eleanor began experiencing the first of many sleepless hours lying in her canopy bed while listening to the sounds of hushed conversations that seemed to echo through the mansion's walls like whispered conspiracies. She noticed things that had previously escaped her attention, how certain rooms were always locked when she passed by, how letters arrived that were immediately hidden from her view, and how family discussions stopped abruptly whenever she approached. Most disturbing of all was her growing awareness of Margaret Beaufort's condition. During her stepmother's brief periods of lucidity, Margaret would grasp Elena's hand with desperate strength and whisper fragmented warnings about trusting no one, about secrets buried deeper than Charleston's ancient graveyards, and about the price that would eventually come due for years of comfortable lies. These moments of clarity never lasted long, always followed by renewed confusion that left Margaret staring at Eleanor as if she were a stranger who had wandered uninvited into her bedroom. The revelation of the family's true financial situation came like a thunderclap on a clear summer day, delivered through a private meeting in Silas Beaufort's mahogany-paneled study on a sweltering August afternoon in 1855. Eleanor had been summoned with unusual formality, finding not only her adopted father waiting, but also the family's longtime attorney, Josiah Petchin, whose presence immediately suggested matters of serious legal consequence. The room felt smaller than usual, the heavy draperies blocking out the harbor breeze, while dust motes danced in shafts of golden sunlight that seemed to illuminate the gravity of whatever discussion was about to unfold. Silas began with the careful deliberation of a man who had rehearsed his words many times, explaining that recent investments in railroad ventures had encountered unexpected difficulties, that several business partnerships had dissolved under unfortunate circumstances, and that the family faced financial pressures that required immediate and decisive action. As he spoke, Eleanor noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he poured brandy into crystal glasses, how his eyes avoided direct contact with hers, and how Pettin shuffled through legal documents with the nervous energy of a man handling explosive materials. The true magnitude of the crisis became clear as Silas outlined the family's debts, mortgages on multiple properties, outstanding loans to Charleston banks, and financial obligations to business partners that had accumulated over years of what he delicately termed aggressive expansion. Without immediate intervention, the Beaufort Empire would collapse within months, taking with it not only their personal fortune, but their social position and political influence. The rice plantations that had supported their lifestyle for generations would be seized by creditors. The Charleston mansion would be sold at auction, and the family name would be forever associated with bankruptcy and scandal. But Silas had discovered a solution, he explained, though it required Eleanor's cooperation and understanding. Through his research into old property records and inheritance laws, he had identified a legal mechanism that could preserve the family's holdings while protecting them from creditor claims. The mechanism required what he described as creative interpretation of existing family relationships, coupled with strategic timing that would take advantage of certain provisions in South Carolina's inheritance statutes. Eleanor listened with growing unease as the true nature of this solution became apparent. By marrying her, Silas could legally claim ownership of any properties that might theoretically belong to her through her deceased parents' estate, while simultaneously protecting those assets under spousal property laws that shielded wives' inheritances from their husbands' business debts. The marriage would be a purely business arrangement, he assured her, designed to preserve the family's wealth and position for future generations while ensuring her own financial security. Pettin produced documents that he claimed proved Eleanor's parents had died intestate without proper wills or legal mechanisms to transfer their properties to their daughter. This meant, according to his interpretation, that any claims Eleanor might have to Ravenel family holdings were legally void making her essentially penniless despite her apparent birthright. The Beauforts, he explained with practiced authority, had spent 8 years providing her with food, shelter, education, and social position that would have been impossible without their generosity. The proposed marriage would simply formalize an arrangement that already existed in practice while solving the family's financial difficulties through legal means that harmed no one. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Silas alternating between paternal affection and businesslike pragmatism, while Pemberton cited legal precedents and statutory interpretations that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Eleanor found herself agreeing to consider their proposal, though something deep in her instincts screamed warnings that she couldn't yet articulate. The room felt increasingly claustrophobic as the meeting progressed, the scent of brandy and tobacco mixing with an underlying odor of fear and desperation that seemed to emanate from both men despite their outward confidence. That evening, Eleanor retreated to her bedroom, with a mind spinning from revelations and implications she was only beginning to understand. She had always known that her adoption represented more than simple charity, but the true nature of the Beaufort family's calculations was more ruthless than she had ever imagined. As she sat by her window overlooking Charleston harbor, watching ships navigate between barrier islands in the gathering dusk, she began to suspect that her parents' death and her own survival might not have been the random tragedy she had always believed. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Beaufort mansion intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Eleanor's increasingly desperate situation. Eleanor's world began to unravel with methodical precision in the weeks following that August meeting, as if invisible hands were systematically dismantling everything she had believed about her life and family. The first crack appeared when she decided to conduct her own investigation into her parents' estate, using skills learned from years of education to research public records and legal documents that the Beauforts had assured her didn't exist. Her search led her to the Charleston County courthouse, where a helpful clerk named Benjamin Hartwell proved far more knowledgeable about property transfers and inheritance records than anyone had expected. Hartwell, a meticulous man in his 60s who took pride maintaining the courthouse's historical archives, showed Alina documents that contradicted everything Pechon had told her about her parents' legal situation. James and Sarah Ravenel had indeed prepared comprehensive wills filed properly with the court in 1846, explicitly leaving all properties and assets to their daughter Eleanor, with detailed instructions for management by appointed trustees until she reached the age of 21. More shocking still were survey maps and land deeds that revealed the true extent of Ravenel holdings. Not just the plantation destroyed in the fire, but thousands of acres stretching across 3 counties, including prime rice-growing territory that happened to border several Beau properties. The documentation painted a picture well far exceeding what Eleanor had ever imagined, making her potentially one of the richest women in South Carolina, rather than the penniless orphan she had been led to believe. But as Hartwell explained with growing concern, many of these legal documents showed signs of tampering, with pages missing, signatures that appeared to have been altered, and filing dates that didn't match the courthouse's internal records. Someone with significant resources and legal expertise had been systematically corrupting the official record of Ravenel family holdings, creating deliberate confusion about Eleanor's true inheritance. Even more disturbing was Hartwell's revelation that he had been contacted multiple times over the years by representatives of the Beaufort family, requesting information about Ravenel property records and inheritance documents. These inquiries had always been presented as routine legal research, but the pattern of requests suggested a coordinated effort to identify and potentially manipulate any evidence of Eleanor's rightful claims to her parents' estate. Eleanor's investigation took a darker turn when she decided to visit the ruins of her childhood home despite years of family prohibition against such trips. The burned plantation site, now overgrown with kudzu and young pine trees, still showed evidence of the fire's destruction. But careful examination revealed details that raised troubling questions about the official story of that November night. The foundation stones showed burn patterns consistent with multiple ignition points rather than a single overturned lamp, while metal fragments scattered throughout the ruins suggested the presence of materials that wouldn't have existed in a typical plantation house. Most significantly, Eleanor discovered the remains of her father's study safe, buried under collapsed timber and debris. The safe itself had been forced open with tools rather than damaged by fire, and its contents had obviously been removed before the flames reached that part of the house. This discovery directly contradicted Sheriff Erlid's official report, which claimed the safe had been destroyed in the blaze along with all family documents. As Eleanor stood among the ruins of her childhood home, memories began surfacing that had been buried for 8 years under layers of trauma and deliberate misdirection. She remembered waking on the night of the fire to the sound of men's voices arguing in her father's study, remembered being hidden in a small space between the walls where her father had told her to wait until morning, and remembered the smell of coal oil being poured deliberately throughout the house before the flames began. These weren't the confused recollections of a traumatized child, but clear memories that had been suppressed by years of being told they were impossible nightmares rather than actual experiences. The investigation Elena conducted in the weeks that followed revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths and property transfers that stretched back more than 15 years, involving families throughout the Low Country, whose holdings had eventually come under Beaufort control through various legal mechanisms. The Middleton family had died in a riverboat accident in 1841, leaving valuable rice plantations that Silas Bowett purchased at below-market prices from their confused heirs. The Drayton family had succumbed to yellow fever in 1844, with their Charleston mansion and surrounding properties somehow passing to Beaufort ownership through complex mortgage arrangements. The Hampton family had simply disappeared in 1846, abandoning their plantation and leaving behind only unpaid debts that Buffett generously assumed in exchange for clear title to their land. Each case showed similar patterns: sudden tragedies that eliminated entire families or rendered survivors unable to manage their own affairs, followed by financial arrangements that benefited the Beauforts while appearing to be acts of community service or business necessity. The legal documentation supporting these transfers was always prepared by Josiah Petillon, whose practice had grown remarkably prosperous during the same period that so many prominent families had encountered misfortune. Elena's growing awareness of these patterns coincided with increasingly disturbing changes in her daily life within the Buffett household. Margaret's condition had deteriorated to the point where she rarely left her bedroom, though during her brief moments of clarity, she began making specific references to Eleanor's parents that suggested knowledge of events she should never have possessed. The servants had started avoiding Elena entirely, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear that suggested they knew far more about the family's intentions than they were willing to reveal. Most ominously, Eleanor began noticing that she was being watched and followed whenever she left the house by men who maintained careful distances, but seemed to appear wherever she went. In Charleston, her correspondence was being intercepted, her conversations monitored, and her movements increasingly restricted under excuses about social propriety and family reputation. The comfortable prison of her adopted life was tightening its boundaries just as she was beginning to understand the true nature of her captivity. The confrontation that would determine Elena's fate began on a rain-soaked evening in late September 1855 when she returned from another trip to the courthouse archives to find the entire Buffett family assembled in the front parlor, their faces bearing expressions of grim determination that left no doubt about the seriousness of their intentions. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times as Elena crossed the threshold, each resonant tone seeming to count down the final moments of the elaborate deception that had defined her adult life. Silas sat behind his mahogany desk like a judge preparing to deliver sentence, while Charles stood by the fireplace with the rigid posture of a military officer, his hand resting casually on the mantelpiece where Eleanor now noticed a loaded pistol had been placed within easy reach. Victoria occupied her mother's usual chair with an air of nervous anticipation, her normally perfect composure cracked by stress lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Even Margaret had been brought downstairs for the occasion, though her pale face and trembling hands suggested she was being sustained by something stronger than natural strength. A wheelchair had been positioned near the window, and Elena could see that Margaret's wrists bore fresh bruises that hadn't been there that morning, suggesting she had been brought to this meeting against her will. The room itself felt different than Elena remembered from countless family gatherings and social occasions. Heavy draperies had been drawn across all windows, blocking any view from the street, while additional oil lamps had been lit to compensate for the artificial darkness. The air carried scents that seemed wrong for a family home: the metallic odor of fear, the chemical tang of medicines, and underneath it all, the sweet corruption smell that Elena had learned to associate with her stepmother's mysterious illness. Eleanor had barely removed her rain-soaked cloak when Silas began speaking with the cold precision of a man who had rehearsed his words many times. His voice carried none of the paternal warmth she remembered from childhood, replaced instead by the calculating tone of a businessman discussing the terms of a particularly difficult contract. He knew about her investigations. He explained about her visits to the courthouse and her unauthorized trip to the Ravenel plantation ruins. Such activities demonstrated a troubling lack of gratitude for everything the family had done for her, as well as a dangerous curiosity about matters that were best left undisturbed for everyone's benefit, including her own. The methodical nature of his knowledge became apparent as Silas detailed exactly where Eleanor had been, whom she had spoken with, and what documents she had examined during her weeks of research. Benjamin Hartwell, the helpful courthouse clerk, had been reporting her activities to Charles Beaufort from the very beginning of her investigation. The friendly conversations about property records and inheritance law had been carefully orchestrated to allow Eleanor to discover just enough truth to understand her situation, while ensuring that every step of her investigation remained under family control. Even her trip to the plantation ruins had been monitored by the same men who had been following her throughout Charleston. The reports, providing the family with detailed knowledge of what she had discovered among the burned foundations of her childhood home. They knew she had found the force safe, had recognized the multiple ignition patterns in the fire damage, and had begun recovering traumatic memories that she had suppressed for 8 years. This growing awareness of the truth had accelerated the family's timeline for implementing their final plans, forcing them to move more quickly than they had originally intended. The truth about her parents' death emerged piece by piece over the next hour, delivered with the methodical brutality of a surgeon removing infected tissue. Silas began with what he described as necessary context, explaining how the Beaufort family's wealth had been accumulated not through traditional business success, but through a systematic campaign of property acquisition that had required the elimination of inconvenient obstacles over more than 2 decades. The rice plantations, the Charleston mansion, the political connections, and the social prominence had all been built on a foundation of murder, fraud, and carefully orchestrated tragedy. James Ravenel had indeed possessed documents proving ownership of vast territories throughout the Low Country, holdings that would have made Eleanor one of the wealthiest individuals in South Carolina. But his wealth represented more than just personal fortune. It posed a direct threat to the Beaufort family's continued expansion and their ability to consolidate control over the region's most valuable agricultural properties. The Ravenel lands were positioned strategically between existing Beaufort holdings, and their acquisition would have created an unbroken empire, stretching from Charleston to the Georgia border. More dangerously, James Ravenel had discovered evidence of the Beaufort family's systematic elimination of rival landowners, documentation of murders, fraudulent property transfers, and bribery of local officials that stretched back nearly 2 decades. His investigation had begun innocently enough, triggered by inconsistencies he had noticed in property transfers involving the Middleton family plantation that bordered his own holdings. What started as routine legal research had gradually exposed a pattern of suspicious deaths and convenient property acquisitions that could only be explained by coordinated criminal activity. Ravenel's evidence had grown more comprehensive and damaging over the months preceding his death, as he systematically investigated every major property transfer in the Low Country since 1835. He had identified at least 17 families whose deaths or disappearances had directly benefited the Beauforts, documented the network of corrupt officials who had facilitated these crimes, and traced financial transactions that proved the family's involvement in hiring professional killers to eliminate obstacles to their ambitions. The scope of Ravenel's investigation had become clear to Silas during their final meeting when the desperate father had laid out his evidence with the thoroughness of a prosecutor preparing for trial. Ravenel possessed signed confessions from witnesses who had been coerced into participating in various aspects of the conspiracy, copies of forged legal documents that had been used to transfer properties after suspicious deaths, and financial records that traced payments from Beaufort accounts to known criminals throughout the Southeast. Most damaging of all, Ravenel had secured testimony from Margaret Beaufort herself, obtained during one of her increasingly frequent periods of lucidity when the effects of her deliberate poisoning had temporarily subsided. Margaret had revealed details about family planning sessions where murders were discussed like business investments, described the methods used to eliminate rival families, and provided specific information about the location of evidence that the family believed had been destroyed in previous killings. Silas's voice grew colder as he described the meeting with James Ravenel, his words carrying the matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing routine business rather than premeditated murder. Ravenel had demanded a meeting ostensibly to negotiate terms for his silence, but Silas had recognized from the beginning that no negotiation was possible. The evidence was too comprehensive, the investigation too advanced, and the threat to the family's survival too immediate to allow for any solution other than complete elimination of both the threat and the evidence. The fire that killed Eleanor's parents had been carefully planned and executed by Charles Beaufort and 3 hired accomplices, men with experience in such matters who had performed similar services for the family on previous occasions. These killers, imported from New Orleans, where they worked for criminal organizations along the Mississippi River, had been brought to Charleston specifically for this operation and provided with detailed plans of the Ravenel house, information about family routines, and precise instructions about what evidence needed to be located and destroyed. Charles had spent weeks observing the Ravenel family's daily patterns, noting when the servants were dismissed, when the family retired for the evening, and when James typically worked late in his study reviewing business documents. The attack had been timed to coincide with a new moon that provided maximum darkness, while the dry autumn weather ensured that any fire would spread quickly enough to destroy evidence before help could arrive. The killers had entered through a basement door that Charles had unlocked during his social visit earlier that week, moving through the house with practiced silence while the family slept. They had confronted James and Sarah Ravenel in the study where the couple had been working late into the night preparing additional documentation for their planned presentation to federal authorities in Charleston. The murders themselves had been accomplished with chloroform-soaked rags that left no obvious signs of violence, allowing the bodies to be positioned as if they had died attempting to escape the flames. Eleanor had survived only because her father had suspected betrayal from the beginning of his negotiations with Silas. The hiding place he had prepared between the walls of the house had been constructed months earlier, accessible through Eleanor's bedroom and equipped with enough supplies to sustain a child for several days if necessary. James had drilled Eleanor repeatedly on the procedure for using this hiding place with strict instructions to remain hidden until morning regardless of what she heard or saw and to flee immediately to a predetermined location if the house showed signs of fire. The trauma of that night had been more severe than anyone realized, as Eleanor had witnessed not only her parents' murder, but also the systematic search and destruction of evidence that followed. From her hiding place, she had watched through cracks in the wall as the killers methodically ransacked her father's study, removing documents, forcing open the safe, and preparing the chemical accelerants that would ensure complete destruction of any evidence they might have missed. The sounds she had suppressed from memory, her mother's muffled screams, her father's futile attempts to negotiate for his family's lives, and the casual conversation of professional killers discussing their work had been gradually returning to her consciousness during her recent investigation. The fire itself had been started with coal oil and chemical accelerants imported specifically for this purpose, substances that burned hot enough to destroy evidence while creating flame patterns that would appear consistent with an accidental household fire. The timing had been calculated to coincide with the driest weather of autumn, maximizing the chances of total structural collapse that would bury any remaining evidence under tons of debris and make detailed investigation both dangerous and largely pointless. Silas had orchestrated Eleanor's rescue and adoption not from charitable impulses, but from practical necessity. As long as she remained alive, there was always a possibility that she might remember crucial details about her parents' evidence or the location of documents they had hidden elsewhere. The family had spent considerable resources determining whether James Ravenel had prepared backup copies of his evidence, hidden in locations that might be revealed through Eleanor's recovered memories or discovered through her knowledge of family habits and hiding places. By keeping Eleanor close and controlling her access to information about her past, the Beauforts could monitor any signs that her memory was returning while presenting themselves as benevolent guardians to the Charleston community. This arrangement had worked perfectly for 8 years, with Eleanor's gratitude and affection for the family ensuring her cooperation while her isolation from her past prevented any dangerous discoveries. The proposed marriage represented the final stage of a plan that had been 8 years in development, refined and adjusted as Eleanor matured, and as the family's understanding of potential legal complications evolved. Once Eleanor became Silas's legal wife, any property claims she might theoretically possess would be consolidated under his control, while spousal immunity laws would prevent her from testifying against him in any future legal proceedings. More importantly, the marriage would provide legal justification for actions they were prepared to take if Eleanor proved unwilling to cooperate with their arrangements. Margaret's deteriorating health, they revealed with casual cruelty, was the result of gradual arsenic poisoning administered through her daily medications over a period of more than 2 years. The process had been deliberately slow to avoid suspicion, designed to mimic the symptoms of various chronic illnesses while gradually reducing her ability to interfere with family business or communicate effectively with outsiders. Her death, which would occur within months, regardless of any medical intervention, would leave Silas legally free to remarry while inheriting her substantial dowry properties that had been carefully protected from his business debts through prenuptial agreements. Eleanor's marriage to a widower would attract far less social scrutiny than other arrangements they had considered, while providing additional legal protections for the family's accumulated wealth. The age difference, while unusual, was not unprecedented in Charleston society, particularly given Eleanor's status as an adopted daughter rather than a blood relative. The family's social position would provide protection against gossip, while their influence over local legal and political institutions would ensure that any challenges to the marriage's legitimacy would be quickly suppressed. As Eleanor listened to these revelations with growing horror, she began to understand the true scope of the trap that had been constructed around her entire adult life. Every kindness had been calculated, every opportunity for independence had been eliminated, and every path forward had been deliberately blocked except for the one that would serve the family's ultimate purposes. The education she had received, the social connections she had been allowed to develop, and even the personal freedom she had enjoyed were all components of a carefully designed prison that had been invisible precisely because it had been constructed from apparent privileges and advantages. The choice they were offering wasn't really a choice at all. Marry Silas willingly and live as a comfortable prisoner, or refuse and face the same fate as her parents and dozens of other obstacles the Beauforts had eliminated over the years. Charles made their position clear with brutal directness. Eleanor knew too much to be allowed her freedom, but she was too valuable as a legal asset to be simply eliminated. The family had invested too much time and resources in her development to discard her casually, but they were prepared to write off that investment if cooperation proved impossible. If she attempted to flee or contact authorities, the hired men who had been watching her for months had orders to ensure she didn't reach her destination alive. These killers, the same professionals who had murdered her parents, were already positioned throughout Charleston with instructions to intercept any attempt at escape or communication with law enforcement. If she somehow managed to present evidence to officials, the family's corruption network was sufficiently extensive to ensure that any investigation would be terminated before it could threaten their interests. The network of corrupt officials that supported the Beaufort conspiracy included not only local sheriffs and judges, but also federal appointees whose positions depended on political support from wealthy Southern families. Evidence could be lost, witnesses could disappear, and investigations could be redirected toward harmless targets while the real criminals remained protected by their wealth and influence. Eleanor's testimony alone, without corroborating physical evidence, would be dismissed as the hysterical accusations of a disturbed young woman whose trauma had affected her mental stability. The confrontation reached its crescendo when Margaret, summoning reserves of strength that surprised everyone in the room, struggled to her feet and began speaking in a voice that carried the authority of impending death. Her words cut through the tension like a blade, revealing that she had been far more aware of the family's activities than anyone had suspected, and far more prepared to oppose them than her apparent helplessness had suggested. Margaret revealed that she had been secretly documenting her husband's crimes for years, recording conversations, copying documents, and preparing evidence of her own that could destroy the family if properly presented. Her apparent mental confusion had been a carefully constructed facade designed to protect her from suspicion while she gathered the information needed to bring down the conspiracy that had destroyed so many innocent lives. The arsenic poisoning that was slowly killing her had also provided the perfect cover for her investigation, as her family attributed her strange behavior and memory problems to the effects of her deteriorating health. The documentation Margaret had prepared proved to be far more comprehensive and damaging than even Eleanor had dared to hope. Hidden in locations throughout the house that had never been searched, her evidence included detailed financial records showing payments to hired killers, correspondence with corrupt officials, maps showing the properties acquired through suspicious circumstances, and even physical evidence like soil samples from crime scenes that contained traces of the chemical accelerants used in suspicious VREs. Most devastating of all were Margaret's recorded observations of family meetings where murders were planned, property transfers were discussed, and the systematic elimination of rival families was coordinated with the cold efficiency of a business operation. She had maintained these records over nearly 15 years, initially as insurance for her own protection, but gradually expanding them into a comprehensive case file that could support federal prosecution of the entire conspiracy. Her knowledge of family operations was so complete that she could provide prosecutors with not only evidence of past crimes, but also detailed information about planned future operations, including the identities of targets who were currently under surveillance for elimination. Margaret's revelation transformed the evening's dynamic completely, as the Beaufort family realized that their most trusted member had been their most dangerous enemy. The careful planning that had sustained their criminal enterprise for decades began to collapse under the weight of internal betrayal, while the prospect of exposure threatened not only their wealth and position, but their very lives. Federal prosecution for conspiracy and murder would almost certainly result in death sentences for both Silas and Charles. while even Victoria faced the possibility of lengthy imprisonment for her role in the family's operations. The confrontation in the parlor deteriorated rapidly as Silas and Charles realized the extent of Margaret's betrayal and the immediate threat it posed to their survival. Silas's initial attempt to negotiate with his dying wife quickly gave way to threats and ultimatums, while Charles moved toward the fireplace, where the loaded pistol offered a more direct solution to their problems. The facade of civilized family discussion evaporated entirely as the true nature of the Beaufort character emerged under pressure, revealing the savage brutality that had always lurked beneath their polished social veneer. Margaret's defiance in the face of death proved more powerful than any weapon the family possessed, as she made clear that her evidence had been carefully hidden and protected by arrangements that would ensure its discovery regardless of what happened to her. She had prepared detailed instructions for Eleanor about the location of this documentation, along with contacts among federal law enforcement officials who were already aware of the general outlines of the Beaufort conspiracy and were waiting only for sufficient evidence to begin formal proceedings. The violence that erupted in the parlor that night marked the final collapse of the Beaufort family's carefully maintained facade as years of suppressed tensions and hidden cruelties exploded into open brutality that would have shocked even their criminal associates. Charles's attempt to seize Margaret's documentation triggered a physical struggle that ended with Margaret's death from a combination of arsenic poisoning and trauma from the violence inflicted by her own son, while Eleanor managed to escape the house with crucial evidence during the chaos that followed. Eleanor's flight through the rain-soaked streets of Charleston that night marked the beginning of the end for the Beaufort dynasty, though the immediate hours following her escape were filled with dangers that tested every survival instinct she had developed during 8 years of carefully concealed captivity. The storm that had provided atmospheric drama for the evening's confrontations now served as both protection and obstacle. As Eleanor navigated familiar streets that had been transformed into alien territory by darkness, rain, and the knowledge that professional killers were already mobilizing to prevent her testimony from reaching federal authorities, the evidence Eleanor carried as she fled the mansion represented more than just documentation of criminal activity. It constituted a complete blueprint of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy in antebellum Southern history. Margaret's hidden records included not only detailed accounts of the Beaufort family's crimes, but also comprehensive information about the network of corrupt officials, hired killers, and complicit business associates who had enabled their operations across multiple states over more than 2 decades. The journey to federal authorities proved more complicated than Eleanor had anticipated, as her years of sheltered existence had left her unprepared for the practical challenges of navigating Charleston's criminal underworld and official corruption networks. The federal marshal's office that Margaret had identified as trustworthy proved to be compromised when Eleanor's initial attempt to present her evidence resulted in immediate notification to Beaufort associates, forcing her to flee before completing her testimony and seek alternative routes to justice. Eleanor's survival during the critical days following her escape was ensured by an unexpected alliance with Benjamin Hartwell, the courthouse clerk whose apparent cooperation with the Beauforts had concealed his own investigation into the family's activities. Hartwell revealed that federal authorities had been building a case against Southern criminal conspiracies for several years using a network of trusted local officials who could operate within corrupt systems while gathering evidence for eventual prosecution. His reports about Eleanor's research had been intended not to expose her activities to the Beauforts, but to protect her from dangers she didn't yet understand, while encouraging her investigation along productive lines. The federal investigation that followed Eleanor's testimony revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single family's greed, encompassing corrupt judges, bought sheriffs, compromised politicians, and a network of hired killers who had eliminated dozens of families throughout the Low Country over 2 decades. The scope of the criminal enterprise shocked even experienced federal prosecutors who discovered that the Beaufort conspiracy had connections to similar operations in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia, suggesting a regional network of property acquisition through systematic murder that threatened the stability of legitimate land ownership throughout the South. The evidence Eleanor and Margaret had provided proved sufficient to support prosecution not only of the immediate Beaufort family, but also of more than 40 accomplices, associates, and corrupt officials whose involvement had enabled the conspiracy to operate undetected for so long. The investigation expanded to include examination of hundreds of suspicious deaths and property transfers, revealing patterns of criminal activity that had affected virtually every major plantation family in the Charleston area over the previous 20 years. The arrest that began in early 1856 created sensations that reverberated throughout Southern society as prominent political figures, respected judges, and established business leaders were taken into custody on charges of conspiracy, murder, and fraud. The Charleston legal establishment found itself under federal investigation, with prosecutors examining decades of property transfers, inheritance disputes, and criminal proceedings for evidence of corruption and complicity in the Beaufort conspiracy. Silas Beaufort's arrest occurred during an attempted flight to Cuba, where he had planned to establish a new identity while accessing hidden financial resources that the family had accumulated in foreign banks as insurance against exactly this type of exposure. Federal marshals intercepted his ship in Charleston Harbor, discovering not only substantial evidence of his crimes, but also detailed plans for continued operations using hired killers and corrupt officials in other states. His capture eliminated any possibility of the conspiracy continuing under his leadership, while providing prosecutors with additional evidence about the scope and organization of the criminal network. Charles Beaufort's resistance to arrest resulted in a gun battle at the family mansion that left 2 federal marshals wounded and several hired killers dead, while Charles himself suffered injuries that left him partially paralyzed and dependent on medical care throughout his subsequent trial. The violence of his resistance provided compelling evidence of his guilt, while eliminating any sympathy that might have been generated by his youth or social position. Victoria Beaufort's arrest occurred under more civilized circumstances, though her subsequent testimony revealed knowledge of family operations that was far more extensive than her demure social persona had suggested. Her detailed understanding of financial arrangements, political connections, and operational procedures demonstrated that she had been a full partner in the conspiracy, rather than an innocent daughter sheltered from family business. Her willingness to testify against her father and brother in exchange for reduced charges provided prosecutors with insider information that proved crucial in securing convictions against the broader network of accomplices. The trials that began in the summer of 1856 captivated Charleston society and drew national attention as the full scope of the Beaufort crimes became public knowledge. The federal courthouse became the center of a legal spectacle that attracted observers from across the country, including journalists, legal scholars, and politicians who recognized the broader implications of the case for Southern society and American justice. The proceedings revealed not only the specific crimes of the Beaufort family, but also the systemic corruption that had enabled their operations, exposing weaknesses in legal and political institutions that extended far beyond Charleston. Eleanor's testimony during these trials provided the crucial link between the physical evidence and the family's systematic criminal activities, while her survival served as powerful proof that justice could ultimately prevail even against the most carefully planned conspiracies. Her presence in the courtroom as a confident, articulate young woman contrasted dramatically with the image of helpless victim that the defense attempted to portray, demonstrating the resilience and intelligence that had enabled her to expose the truth despite years of manipulation and control. The evidence presented during the trials painted a comprehensive picture of criminal enterprise that had operated with corporate efficiency and calculated brutality. Prosecutors documented the systematic elimination of at least 37 families whose deaths had directly benefited the Beauforts, along with evidence suggesting additional murders that could not be definitively proven due to the destruction of records and elimination of witnesses. The financial scope of the conspiracy was equally staggering, with stolen properties valued at more than $2 million, a fortune that represented one of the largest accumulations of criminal wealth in American history. Silas Beaufort was convicted of multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy, sentenced to death by hanging in a proceeding that attracted crowds of spectators from across the South. His execution, carried out in the Charleston City Jail in March 1857, drew thousands of observers who viewed his death as symbolic justice for decades of unpunished crimes. His final statement from the gallows included no expressions of remorse, only bitter complaints about the federal interference in what he characterized as legitimate business practices appropriate to Southern society. Charles Beaufort received a similar sentence, though his execution was delayed by appeals that prolonged the legal proceedings for more than 2 years. His eventual hanging in 1859 marked the end of direct Beaufort involvement in Southern criminal enterprises, though investigations revealed that similar operations continued in other states under different family names. Victoria's conviction on lesser charges resulted in a 20-year prison sentence, though she served only 12 years before being released due to deteriorating health that may have been related to her own gradual poisoning by family medicines. The broader prosecutions that followed the Beaufort convictions effectively dismantled the corruption network that had enabled their crimes, with more than 20 public officials receiving various sentences and dozens of business associates facing financial ruin through asset forfeit and civil penalties. The legal proceedings established important precedents for federal prosecution of interstate criminal conspiracies while demonstrating the federal government's willingness to intervene in Southern affairs when local institutions proved inadequate to address systematic corruption. Eleanor's reclaimed inheritance made her one of the wealthiest women in the South, but more importantly, her courage in exposing the truth provided closure for the families of dozens of victims who had died without justice or even proper recognition of their murders. The properties that were restored to her through the legal proceedings included not only her parents' original holdings, but also compensation for properties that had been stolen from other victim families who lacked surviving heirs to press their claims. The management of Eleanor's vast inheritance required the establishment of new legal and financial institutions, as the scope of her holdings exceeded the capacity of existing Charleston business establishments to handle effectively. The trust arrangements that were created to oversee her properties became models for similar institutions throughout the South, helping to establish more transparent and accountable systems for managing large agricultural operations and preventing the type of criminal infiltration that had characterized the antebellum period. Eleanor's decision to leave Charleston shortly after the trials concluded reflected both her desire for privacy about the traumatic experiences that had shaped her adult life and a recognition that remaining in the city would subject her to constant reminders of her family's murder and her own years of captivity. Her departure was accomplished quietly with minimal public attention, though her ongoing financial support for victim families and charitable institutions ensured that her influence on Charleston society continued long after her physical presence had ended. The schools and charitable institutions that Eleanor established in other states reflected her commitment to preventing the type of systematic victimization that had characterized her own experience, and that of so many other families destroyed by the Beaufort conspiracy. Her educational initiatives focused particularly on providing opportunities for orphan children and young women who lacked family protection, recognizing that vulnerability and isolation had been crucial factors in enabling the criminal exploitation that had defined her own childhood. The psychological impact of Eleanor's experiences remained with her throughout the rest of her long life. Though she demonstrated remarkable resilience in transforming personal trauma into constructive social action, her private correspondence preserved in the archives of institutions she established reveals ongoing struggles with trust, recurring nightmares, and persistent fears of vulnerability that never completely subsided despite her eventual financial security and social independence. The Beaufort properties were sold at public auction to provide restitution for victim families, though the process proved complicated by the extent of fraudulent documentation and the difficulty of establishing clear ownership chains for properties that had been acquired through criminal means. The legal proceedings required to sort out these ownership issues continued for more than a decade, establishing important precedents for handling property disputes involving criminal activity while ensuring that stolen assets were ultimately returned to legitimate owners or their heirs. The mansion on East Bay Street was eventually demolished rather than sold, too associated with tragedy for any buyer to consider it habitable. The site remained vacant for many years, eventually becoming a small park where a memorial plaque commemorates the victims of the Beaufort conspiracy, without providing details that might attract morbid curiosity. Local residents report that the location retains an atmosphere of sadness that persists despite the passage of more than a century and a half since the crimes that occurred there. The broader implications of the Beaufort case extended far beyond Charleston, exposing weaknesses in legal and political systems that had enabled such extensive criminal activity to flourish unchecked for decades. The case led to reforms in property law, inheritance procedures, and judicial oversight that helped prevent similar conspiracies in other regions. Though the fundamental human capacity for greed and violence that had driven the Beauforts remained unchanged by legal and institutional improvements, federal law enforcement agencies used the Beaufort case as a model for investigating other suspected criminal conspiracies throughout the South, leading to additional prosecutions that revealed the extent to which systematic corruption had infiltrated antebellum Southern society. These investigations demonstrated that the Beaufort conspiracy, while particularly extensive and well-organized, was part of a broader pattern of criminal activity that had affected property ownership and political institutions throughout the region. The historical significance of the Beaufort case has continued to grow over time as scholars have recognized its importance in documenting the transition from local corruption to federal law enforcement that characterized the antebellum period. The case represents one of the earliest examples of successful federal prosecution of interstate criminal conspiracy, establishing legal precedents that would prove crucial during Reconstruction and subsequent efforts to address systematic violations of civil rights throughout the South. Eleanor Ravenel's story ultimately stands as a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of overwhelming corruption, while serving as a reminder of the dark potential that exists. When wealth and power are combined with moral emptiness and institutional failure, Her transformation from helpless victim to powerful advocate for justice represents one of the most remarkable personal journeys in American legal history, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies cannot ultimately prevail against determined opposition supported by moral clarity and institutional commitment to justice. The marriage certificate that still exists in Charleston courthouse records serves as a haunting reminder of how close the Beaufort conspiracy came to achieving its ultimate goal. While the absence of Eleanor's signature on that document represents a victory for justice that came at enormous personal cost, the document itself has become a historical artifact that researchers use to understand the methods employed by criminal conspiracies to manipulate legal institutions. While Eleanor's courage continues to inspire those who face their own struggles against powerful and seemingly untouchable adversaries, the case continues to be studied by legal scholars and historians as an example of how systematic corruption can flourish in American society when institutional safeguards prove inadequate, while also demonstrating the potential for individual action to expose and defeat even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. Eleanor's story provides hope that justice can ultimately prevail even in the darkest circumstances, though the price of such victory is often measured in human suffering that echoes across generations and leaves permanent scars on both individuals and communities. This mystery shows us that even in the darkest chapters of American history, individual acts of courage and moral clarity can overcome the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies, though the price of such victory is often measured in human suffering that echoes across generations. What do you think of Elena's story? Do you believe justice was truly served, or did the scope of the Beaufort crimes extend beyond what any legal system could fully address? Leave your comment below with your thoughts about this remarkable case. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about American society, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories that blur the line between historical fact and almost unbelievable truth. See you in the next video where we'll explore another dark corner of America's hidden past.